Today is March 9th, 2017, and I'm pleased to be here with Bob Cortright, a longtime transportation planner at the Department of Land Conservation and Development. My name is Ben Kahn, and I'm a student at Portland State's Master of Urban and Regional Planning program. As part of the program called People in the Land, an oral history of Oregon's statewide land use planning program, Bob will be discussing his experience with Oregon's land use system and at DLCD. The project aims to document the stories, anecdotes, and experiences of people who were influential in the development of Oregon's statewide planning program, as well as share thoughts on how the system has evolved over the years, where you think it may be headed. Thank you for taking the time to contribute to this project, and let's get started.
Okay.
Can you describe your experience and relationship with DLCD and Oregon's land use system?
Sure. I started as a student intern at DLCD in, are you ready, January 1975. Wow. And spent my entire career working for the department. So I was an intern for 6-9 months, and then I was hired as a temporary employee in June of 1976. I was hired as a regional representative, field rep in 1979. I worked on the coast for 3 years. From 1981 to 1984, I worked as the lead coastal program staff person. So between 1976 and 1984, I worked on the original coastal goals that were adopted, goals 16 through 19, and in amendments that were adopted in 1984. I was the lead staff working on amendments to Goal 8 for destination resorts. And let's see, other urban issues. So I also worked on what was called the Rule for Incorporation of New Cities, which affected the proposed city of Rajneeshpuram and the Rajneeshis in 1981. Let's see. So, started working on transportation issues in 1988, and that corresponded with what was called the Urban Growth Management Study that was done 1989 to 1991. In 1991 or 1990-91, worked on development of what is now called the Transportation Planning Rule that was adopted in May of 1991. Shortly after that, but Governor Barbara Roberts started the Transportation and Growth Management Program, a joint program between ODOT and DLCD. So I worked on as the lead transportation staff person on that program for DLCD from 1991 to 2008. In 2008, I started working on climate change issues and planning for reductions of greenhouse gas emissions, scenario planning, also in coordination with ODOT. So that happened 2008 until I retired in 2015.
Okay. So you've had a lot of experience in a lot of different areas with DLCD, but it looks like transportation makes that the largest part of your career.
Yeah, I mean, so I worked on a broad range of issues. I mean, again, as a regional representative early in the program and on coastal issues, but ultimately urban issues became the thing I was most interested in transportation.
Okay. And so the transportation goal was written in 1991?
The Transportation Planning Rule was written in 1990-91.
Okay.
So Goal 12, one of the original statewide planning goals, was developed and adopted in 1974.
Okay. And so with your time on the coast, and you've worked in both rural and urban environments, what sort of differences are there in terms of transportation planning between the urban and rural?
Between urban and rural environments. Well, I mean, there's some similarities wherever you are, and then there are differences. So the similarities are, I think one of the big things that the Transportation Planning Rule is about is reducing reliance on the automobile and expanding or improving the ability to walk and bicycle as a mode of transportation. And the prescription is pretty much the same regardless of the size of the community. Small communities and large communities are made up of neighborhoods and having walkable streets and a good network of streets is really essential to providing walkability, whether it's a community of a couple thousand or the Portland metropolitan area. So that's kind of a basic building block or recipe. For rural areas, I mean, again, I think most of the focus of transportation planning is on how you make communities work. The longer distance connections between communities are pretty much decided and set. There isn't too much more to be done in terms of building big new highways to connect regions of the state.
Mm-hmm. That's true. And so you said the goal is to reduce reliance on automobiles. Have you been successful in that, and what in particular has contributed towards that mission?
Boy, big question.
Yeah.
I think certainly we've done a lot to get there. I mean, urban growth boundaries as kind of a starting point of having compact urban development. And this might tell you a little bit about the genesis of the transportation planning rule. So again, in the late 80s, in basically the mid 80s, LCDC had completed acknowledgement of all of the comprehensive plans. Mm-hmm. So all of the cities and all of the counties in the state had state adopted approved comprehensive plans. And at that point, it was kind of an assessment of, okay, so what have we accomplished? Or have we accomplished what we set out to do in developing and adopting all of these plans for communities across the state? And so it prompted an evaluation of basically urban growth boundaries, and were we getting the kind of development within urban growth boundaries that we had anticipated? Mm-hmm. And one of the criticisms, and the person who I think was most effective at delivering it was Andras Dwani. I don't know if you know that name or not.
Do not.
Okay. Dwani is a nationally famous urbanist, and he came to Portland and said basically, well, you guys have done a good job of containing growth, but the kind of growth that is occurring within urban growth boundaries is really no different than what is occurring in other areas around the country. So don't feel too good about yourselves. And I think that caused people to pause and say, well, are we? Are we doing more than just containing sprawl or having it be more compact? Are we achieving the kinds of development patterns that we want and we think will make, Oregon communities sustainable and livable? Mm-hmm. And so that prompted some introspection. And basically what we found in the urban growth management study was that we were under building plan densities, that the way we planned for public facilities and coordinated planning was we had objectives for more compact development, but by and large that it wasn't happening. And one of the reasons was development was occurring incrementally, roughly at about 5 acres at a time, that we had kind of a patchwork pattern of development. So I think the recognition was that we needed to do more than just contain growth. We needed to think carefully about how we plan for land use and for transportation within urban growth boundaries to get more compact, walkable kinds of development. Mm-hmm. And that was true on the transportation side, is basically cities and counties plan for arterial and collector streets, and the local street network evolved as individual developments happened, as subdivisions were built, as commercial developments had happened. And generally the inclination of developers was they were interested in doing nothing more than providing what was necessary for their development and providing access to automobiles. So there really wasn't much thought out about how do we create a good network of streets and how do we provide a walkable, bikeable community. Mm-hmm. So again, I think the results of the urban growth management study were we need to think much more carefully about how we develop within urban growth boundaries to get the kinds of development we want. So transportation planning rules adopted in 1991. Communities are directed to develop transportation system plans, and also I think a broad recognition that we need to think more carefully about how we plan urban land use. Mm-hmm. And the Transportation Growth Management Program is created funding to cities and counties to look at ways that they can both plan for transportation and think about promoting walkable mixed-use land use patterns. And I think that program has been dramatically successful in helping communities, at least those that are interested in looking at ways that they can get higher densities, more mixed use, more walkable development, and transportation plans. So I think if you compare Oregon to other community or other states now, mm-hmm. and Oregon communities to other communities around the state, around the country, we've done a much better job of building in walking and cycling and having compact land use patterns. I think there's still a lot of room to improve, just because the changes in development patterns are difficult to achieve over time. It requires a lot of leadership, but we've created a foundation that we can clearly build on.
So you said that it's been successful, especially with the communities that are on board. Have there been communities that are less receptive to the idea that transportation needs to be handled on a regional level?
I think it's something that we struggle with because historically land use and transportation planning have been done separately. I mean, land use planners decide planning and zoning, and public works and transportation engineers decide where and when to build roads. And particularly on the road building side, there's been real reluctance to be responsive to what the objectives of land use planners are. We are just about moving vehicles or accommodating transportation needs. And the idea that you think carefully about how land use is done or transportation is done to facilitate particular kinds of land use is the kind of thing that at least transportation engineers and planners have been more reluctant to do. They view it more as social engineering. So, I mean, agreement on what the objectives of land use and transportation planning are is really important, and breaking down the silo view, particularly of traffic engineers and the well-developed machinery for building roads that are designed and highways that are designed for moving cars is a pretty big problem or issue that we have to deal with.
Yeah, and recently the UGB has been expanded for the first time, or at least in a large way for the first time.
The Portland
UGB.
Yep.
And so obviously there are a lot of transportation challenges that come with that. And how do you handle that as the state planning agency?
Well, again, and this is something I didn't elaborate on, is there are different requirements for different sizes of communities. So for metropolitan areas, which include Portland as well as Salem, Eugene, Medford, Bend, Corvallis, those urban areas, before they can expand or as part of their transportation plans, have to show that they are reducing reliance on the automobile. And that started in 1991 with the requirement that communities plan for metropolitan areas plan for a 10% reduction in vehicle miles traveled, to set kind of an overall metric of reducing reliance. And the idea behind that broad measure was individual metropolitan areas could come up with ways that best met their individual needs or circumstances to reduce reliance on the automobile. That's since evolved in 2006 to authorize communities to have alternative performance measures or alternative standards that show how they reduce reliance on the automobile. But now when communities are proposing to expand their urban growth boundaries, they have to first show that they're carrying out those programs to reduce reliance on the automobile, that they're meeting the standards that they've adopted usually to expand alternative modes of transportation or promote compact mixed-use development.
And that's been successful, these?
Well, one of the things was there was a bit of slack in urban growth boundaries. So we are just now reaching the point where communities are considering urban growth boundary amendments. So for example, in 2008, the city of Bend proposed, I believe it was a 4,000 or 5,000 acre expansion of their urban growth boundary. They had yet to meet the transportation planning rule requirements to reduce reliance on the automobile. Our commission sent them back saying, until you show how you reduce reliance on the automobile, we're not going to approve an urban growth boundary amendment. Just last year, the commission approved basically about 1,000 acre expansion of the Bend urban growth boundary, and Bend did show how they're going to reduce reliance on the automobile, both by promoting more compact land use and by expanding alternative transportation.
Great. So I'm going to switch gears just a little bit here. So you started working on urban transportation in 91, is that correct?
Probably 88, 89.
88. So that was right about the start of the opening of the original Blue Blue Max line. Is that correct?
I'm trying
Maybe
to
a
remember,
little bit
but I think it
after.
may have been earlier than that
Yeah.
it opened, but roughly speaking, yeah.
Was that, I'm not too familiar with the DLCD's role in the creation of that. Was there any role at all?
Not really. I mean, and I think you mentioned the Mount Hood Freeway, is that the creation of the light rail line or the funding for it was, a strong push to reallocate, or actually the reallocation of the federal money that had been identified for the Mount Hood Freeway to a series of improvements, including upgrading the Banfield I-84 and providing light rail. So that occurred pretty much before and outside of either adoption of Goal 12 in the early 70s or the initial round of transportation planning. So I think it was something that certainly decision makers, policymakers were aware of. I think a more seminal kind of event in the development of Goal 12, remember this was in 1974, was the year before was the Arab oil embargo and what was called the gasoline crisis. Basically, people were waiting in lines at gas stations to get gasoline, and it became painfully apparent how dependent we were on automobiles. And not to say that people didn't say we should just have more gas, but it was a recognition that, boy, there ought to be better planning for other modes of transportation. And I think that's what led to inclusion of the requirement in Goal 12 when it was adopted in 1974 to avoid principal reliance on any one mode of transportation. The goal didn't say much about how that would be accomplished, and that was one of the things in 1990-91 when we're doing the urban growth management study that people started to ask was, well, how do you avoid principal reliance on the automobile? Or more specifically, how does LCDC measure whether or not a plan is accomplishing that? And that discussion led to the development of the VMT standard, which is now modified in the transportation planning rule.
Okay. Kind of fast forwarding to today, is there any place for highway expansion in the state? I know that there's some rumblings about the West Side bypass being reconsidered in the CRC as well.
I don't think that proposals for highway building will go away. What I'd say is the era of highway building is over. I think a lot of people are living kind of the legacy or fighting the last war. Certainly in the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, building highways was critical to industrial and economic development in the United States. But we're a mature economy now, and adding highways doesn't really do anything to expand economic development in the way that it did 40, 50 years ago. All it really does is redistribute traffic and change development patterns in metropolitan areas. I don't think there's any convincing evidence that it significantly increases economic development. Whether that is sufficient to overcome the interests of individual communities who would say, well, boy, a new highway would benefit us or cause more development in our community or benefit individual property owners, no question. People will always be interested in another highway or another freeway interchange to benefit their community. But in terms of whether it benefits the state or increases economic development or prosperity, I don't think there's really any evidence of it. The other thing is, I mean, the fact that we, over the last 40, 50 years, have invested in building a transportation system, we really need to shift to maintaining what we have and the costs and the economics of what's necessary to maintain what we have and upgrade it to withstand a Cascadia subduction zone earthquake, and the fact that transportation has just fundamentally changed. All those things work against anything really significant in the way of highway expansion.
Okay. And so you spent the last 7 years of your career focusing on climate change issues.
Yep.
How did you use your experience with transportation, and how does transportation intertwine with climate change issues, in your view?
Well, I think the short answer is that I think the prescription that we had been working on is still valid. I mean, that having compact urban growth and reducing reliance on the automobile by expanding alternative modes of transportation is really the best way that urban development can help reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And the facts are, transportation is one of our biggest sources of greenhouse gas emissions, and in particular, household dependence or household automobile travel is a large source of emissions. Certainly, technology will improve the efficiency of vehicles and reduce the emissions of individual vehicles, but given growth in population and the goals that we have for reducing emissions, 75% below where they were in 1990, we really need to do more than improve vehicle efficiency to significantly reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And the best way we can do that is create communities where people don't have to drive or don't have to drive as much. And that's really what we had been working to do through the transportation planning rule and urban growth boundaries from the beginning. So in large part, it reinforces what we have been doing and really points to we need to do even more of it, be more effective.
Okay. So what does that mean in terms of actual plans or, on the ground sorts of impacts?
Well, do you want to ask that again, or what are you getting at?
I guess I'm just trying to find out how that impacts people on a day-to-day level.
Well, I think this is one of the things where things are changing regardless. I mean, people are making very different transportation decisions. And this is a little commentary, or it's worth making a comment about how transportation plans have been done. We have gotten around in the last 10 to 15 years, based on detailed travel surveys or what transportation modelers observe about how people make travel decisions. And we assume that 20 years into the future, an expanded population will make essentially the same sort of travel decisions that people made when we look back for the last 10 to 15 years. And what we know now is transportation is undergoing a fundamental change in terms of people's interests or the reasons for travel. Transportation is fundamentally about getting access to goods and services and interacting with people. And our methods for acquiring goods and services and interacting with people are undergoing fundamental changes due to the internet, cell phones, you name it. I mean, so people have very different choices. The other thing is, I think that transportation planning has tended to, especially road planning, has tended to assume that demand will grow regardless of what we do. That basically demand for transportation is a fluid that has to be accommodated. If we don't accommodate it, that congestion will occur. And the reality is people will adapt their transportation behavior to the options that are available. So if there are fewer options to drive long distances, people will adapt where they live and where they choose to drive and how often they choose to drive to reflect the kind of choices that are available. So fundamental changes in how transportation works, and we need to recognize, or we need to have that kind of recognition. So how does that affect people? I think people are already changing their transportation choices is the bottom line, and I think that they will continue to. Are we providing the kinds of urban living situations that people want to choose? And I think there's good evidence that there's a lot more demand for walkable, compact, mixed-use development than our urban areas currently provide. And rents are pretty good. The demand for people willing to pay those higher prices for those kinds of environments tells you there's more demand for that.
Okay. That's actually pretty interesting. And again, I'll just switch gears. I'm just going to go with whatever's on the top of my head here. But so part of this is about capturing the events that took place sort of the beginning of DLCD.
Okay.
So I'm curious if you have any memorable stories or anecdotes that you'd be willing to share.
Well, we've talked about the transportation planning rule, so let me tell you a little story about that. So, I mean, you've talked about the Mount Hood Highway, and you mentioned the Western Bypass, but the transportation planning rule really grew out of the proposal for the Western Bypass. Actually, in 1986, 87, it was called the Southwest Corridor Study, a study that was done by Metro looking at building a peripheral highway that linked from I-5 to Highway 26. And Thousand Friends appealed a decision made by Metro authorizing the Southwest Corridor Study. And the real question was, gee, at what point was Metro making a land use decision to allow a highway? And Thousand Friends said, you're making a decision, and Metro said, no, we're not making a decision yet, we make that decision later. So there was a real debate about, well, how do land use and transportation planning interact? At what point is a decision about a highway or transportation planning intersect with the land use requirements? So that question was out there. And LUBA found that the Southwest Corridor Study was a land use decision and said that Metro had to comply with the statewide planning goals. The State Department of Transportation was very concerned about that, because at that point it became apparent that decisions that they might be pursuing all around the state might be land use decisions. So they came to our commission and said, LCDC, we would like you to adopt a highway planning rule to explain how your goals apply, how and when the goals apply to siting of transportation facilities. So I think they expected something very narrow from our commission that would clear up how highway planning could go forward. Well, our commission and Thousand Friends, who I think saw this as an opportunity to say, well, let's talk a little bit more broadly about this, about how land use and transportation relate. And again, this was at roughly the time that the urban growth management study was occurring. And the chair of our commission, Bill Blosser, saw this as an opportunity, and he's the one that basically raised the question of, well, Goal 12 says reduce reliance on the automobile. Okay, department, what's our standard for judging whether or not plans accomplish that? And are they accomplishing that? And we basically had to say, we don't have a clear standard, and we aren't sure that we've really applied or implemented that standard, and that precipitated the discussion that led to adding that and looking more expansively. So a combination of the urban growth management study and the persistence by our chair at that time, Bill Blosser, led to a broader transportation planning rule than I think was expected by the Department of Transportation.
Has that helped clarify how land use and transportation?
I think that it has, no question that it has. Whether it came down where the transportation planners would like it to come down, I mean the ODOT planners, I think they would, they're a little bit frustrated by it. I think the other kind of interesting historical footnote is 1991 was also the year of the first major federal transportation planning law, ICE-T. And I think one of the things that we were a little concerned about as we were writing the transportation planning rule, we knew there was a federal law being developed, is are we going to end up with conflicting direction between what the federal and state laws require? And actually what we found was they're pretty much pointing in the same direction.
Okay, so it's more of a nationwide trend, I guess, in terms of thinking about transportation and land use issues. Okay. Very interesting. You want to talk about your time working on the coastal issues?
Sure. I mean, so I think what I'd say is I've been incredibly fortunate throughout my career to kind of be at kind of key points in the statewide planning program. So I arrived in January 1975 as an intern. This is a month after the statewide planning goals were originally adopted. So I walked in and said, what can I do to help? And they said, well, we've just adopted these goals, and they tell local governments that they have to go out and do comprehensive plans. So the first thing I got to work on was putting together what's called an information source catalog, which is basically where's the inventory information that local governments can use to address the statewide planning goals. So it gave me the opportunity to go out and meet with all different agencies to find out what information they had, and to think about, and talk with people within the department about, well, what does the goal require? What information is needed to require? Who has the information? And then to find out what the information was and how you would get to it. So that gave me a real, good opportunity to understand the scope of the program. At the same time, in March of '76, or it was March of '75, the Oregon Coastal Conservation and Development Commission, do you know what that is? OCC and DC. So this was a commission that was created in 1971 to figure out how we better plan for the Oregon coast. That commission worked from '71 to '75. In '75, the legislature, or in '73, the legislature said, OCCC, the Coastal Commission, you're done. Send your work to LCDC. LCDC will adopt coastal goals. So one of the things I did was I had an opportunity I got drafted to help work on developing the coastal goals. And I wasn't, I was an assistant in that process, but I got to work with the people who had spent 4 years at the Coastal Commission and converting their broad policy recommendations into specific coastal goals. So got to work with, I think, some of the sharpest people who have ever worked for this program. Ted LaRoe is one. Ted's since passed on, and I don't know how much has been done to capture the history of the coastal program, but there were some really exceptional people. Ted was he worked for the Federal Office of Coastal Resource Management, and he was also one of the top wetland scientists in the country. He helped develop the system of wetland classification that's still used today for figuring out how you deal with estuaries. So, and he was brilliant. So
that's really fascinating. It's especially fascinating that you started just a month after the goals were written. And you were going out and meeting with local governments to go. Is that right? You were.
It was mostly going out and meeting with other state agencies who had information. So, where were the soil surveys for agricultural land? Where were the information on forest land? Where's housing information? Where's information about natural resources under Goal 5, natural hazards? So it was basically compiling a list of all the available information that people could use to do planning.
How did the other agencies feel about DLCD and the goals at the time, because it was just so new? There's probably so little information.
I think it varied. I mean, they saw it both as an opportunity to advance the interests of their agencies and to have information really affect decisions. At the same time, I think there was a little caution about the new kid on the block. Here's this agency that's talking about the stuff we're the expert about and telling communities how to plan. So there was a little anxiety about that, but somewhere between opportunity and anxiety.
And over time, it sounds like it became.
I think they understood the program, and I mean, in part, they were kind of happy to have our agency be the foil. It wasn't that they were being blamed as the state for raising these issues. It was LCDC, the evil LCDC, that was forcing people to deal with these issues.
Yeah. Okay. So where do you see Oregon's? How do you see Goal 12 factoring into Oregon's future of transportation? I just want to hear your thoughts, I guess.
Well, maybe to talk a little bit about so what have we accomplished? We're now at a point similar to where we were in the late '80s, where everybody's done a transportation system plan. Every community that needs one has a transportation system plan that says, okay, what do we need in the way of roads, highways, sidewalks, bikeways, transit to meet future transportation needs? And what we haven't done, or what would be very helpful to do, is say, so has that got us, or what's the likelihood that that's going to get us where we want? And I think the report card is mostly good.
Mm-hmm.
We've revised planning and zoning to do a better job of building in walking and cycling so that we do new development in a way now that promotes walking and cycling. We do more to promote transit planning. Do we do enough? Have we done enough to get where we want to go? No, there's probably more room to get there. I think one of the big problems we have is financial realities, which is plans are not, for the most part, financially constrained. Metropolitan areas are required to have financially constrained plans, but those financially constrained plans assume that revenue is going to continue to go up and up and up at a rate that we haven't experienced. So plans assume that there's going to be a lot more money than we are reasonably likely to have. So are the plans realistic? Probably not.
Okay.
At least in terms of their expectations for major roadway building. And it would be good if we went back and reconciled, if we thought more about what we can really do if congestion is a problem, what can we really do to address those problems? And it isn't building a whole bunch of new roads, because we know that we don't have the money for it, and even if we did, it wouldn't be effective. It's probably shifting to other kinds of solutions. And that's something that I think we will continue to struggle with, is the other solutions, which are parking management or pricing and expanding transit, transportation demand management programs, congestion pricing. Those things are more difficult to do. And we don't really have a whole lot of leadership outside of the Portland metropolitan area to make those things happen.
Okay. And obviously in the future, transportation is likely to be upended by automation and driverless cars.
Driverless cars?
Yeah. Sounds like that's not a huge concern at the moment.
I think we'll have to wait and see how that works out. What you see with Uber, and I don't know if you read the New York Times the other day, but one of the things that's happening is there's a lot more vehicles on the road.
Because of private transportation.
Right.
TNCs, yeah.
And that doesn't reduce congestion. It increases congestion. And it raises the basic question of, until we start charging people in a way, the only way you can really reduce congestion is congestion pricing in some form. And so until we get there, it's not going to happen. There are benefits to having Uber and those kind of services in terms of reducing the need for people to own automobiles. But until you deal with roadway pricing in some way, it's not going to significantly improve congestion problems.
Another issue with Uber and other sorts of private transportation like that is equity in just car ownership in general, and especially right now with land use in Portland and increasing rents, pushing people out farther and farther from their jobs, increases transportation costs. Is that any sort of consideration by in what DLCD does for transportation?
Yes, but I think it's an issue to think about more broadly than transportation. Certainly, I think transportation costs are a household's second largest expense. So if people have to own an automobile or have to travel long distances, that is affecting how affordable the place is that people choose to live. And that's one of the reasons that I think we promote walkable, compact development, is to provide opportunities for those kind of spaces. I think the other thing I say is transportation is a pretty building more highways to reduce transportation costs is a pretty ineffective way to improve housing affordability. The housing problem is one principally of supply. We clearly need to provide more supply to reduce the cost of housing. And what rents are showing you, increase in rents in the Portland metropolitan area, especially in close-in neighborhoods, is what do people want? They want walkable, mixed-use areas to live in. So we really need to build more housing in those places.
Okay.
The good news is there's lots of opportunities to do that. I don't know if you've read Chris Nelson's work?
I haven't, no.
Okay.
Not familiar.
You should.
What's the basic premise?
Well, he talks about a couple of things. One is that we're undergoing a huge demographic shift. We're moving to older, smaller households, and that's going to change the kinds of housing that people want. And what he says in essence is, we have enough single-family houses on lower or middle densities to meet needs through the next 30 or 40 years. What we really need is a lot more housing in close-in mixed-use areas, multifamily and higher density housing. And there's lots of opportunities to do that, basically by redeveloping along commercial strips where we have huge areas of surface parking.
And infill and
Yep.
anything that
And I think that's really where planning has to go. I mean, thinking forward about both achieving greenhouse gas emissions and dealing with the financial realities is we need to look at the opportunities for infill and redevelopment in our existing urban areas, and particularly along those major corridors where you have big parcels that are in commercial development for the most part. Retail is this is part of the change in transportation, is retail is undergoing a fundamental change due to people's ability to get goods and services via the internet. The demand for surface or for land to meet retail needs is dropping dramatically.
So it seems like over this conversation, I've gotten an impression that transportation planning has sort of evolved from the standalone idea to this place where you really have to focus on all the other issues, and then transportation is sort of a good transportation network is a byproduct of good land use planning. Is that correct?
Well, yes. I mean, I think it gets back to, I think we still struggle with using the models, and I use that term both little m and big M, the actual models that we use and the approach that we use, still assumes that people are going to continue to travel what transportation needs are. And I think if we stand back and look at the bigger driving forces, the fundamental change in transportation and the fact that we're running out of money to build new transportation infrastructure, if we think creatively, then we'd start to build a lot more compact mixed-use development that can easily be developed. And this is one of the things that, if we look back at the parts of our communities that work well, they're the ones that were built, in the turn of the previous century, in the 1920s, 30s, where you had a good network of streets and walkable neighborhoods. Those areas work very well. And what doesn't work as well is the kind of development that we built over the last, between the 50s and the 80s.
Post-war development. Well, this is coming towards the end, but I wanted to see if there's any last thoughts, any last things you want to say.
I'm sure there's more there. I mean, I think one of the things that has been very helpful is, again, the Transportation and Growth Management Program. That was really, again, if you go back to this inflection point of 1991, when the Urban Growth Management Study is completed, we need to get more compact development within urban growth boundaries. Federal transportation law is adopted that gives states more flexibility about how to spend federal transportation funds. And Governor Barbara Roberts says, okay, agencies, let's figure out ways that we can work together to accomplish goals for the state. And so that's where the real leadership came from for creating the TGM program that gave resources to communities to do more compact mixed-use land use development. So I think that resource has been critical to the kind of innovation that Oregon communities have been able to do.
Great. Well, thank you, Bob. This has been very helpful and very informative. I guess that concludes this oral history.
Great.